Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting a loose woodland stream, a misty scene. I want it to be very pale and have a nice glow of light in the middle of the painting where everything recedes off into the misty distance. I'm using Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper. It's taped to my board, and my board's at an angle of about 45 to 60 degrees so that gravity will help with the painting and the flow of water as I'm using the wet in wet technique. I'm using my large bamboo harky brush, but you can use any brush, any large brush, to wet the paper thoroughly. And now I'm using raw sienna, and I'm just bringing it across sort of fairly randomly, a medium to light mixture of it across the middle of the paper where I want to have a sort of a distant glow of light through the misty woodland. This mixture here is indigo and perylene green, and I'm sweeping it in across from the sides towards the middle, leaving the gap in the middle, and across the bottom and across the top. This is a fairly rich mixture of these two colours. Now I've turned my board around 90 degrees to stop the paint from flowing down too fast and too far down the page. If I need to, I can just smooth with the brush, just very, very gently, just to try and get this underpainting sort of blended a little bit. I'm avoiding blending in that middle area because that's nice and light. I've got my nice raw sienna glow in the middle, so I'm just making sure that everything is nice and soft around the edges. I'm pulling out a little bit of extra light across the middle just with a clean tissue or piece of kitchen towel. And everything's all nice and soft, and it'll get even softer as it dries. Now once it's begun to dry a little bit, so that the paper is still damp all over, and it's cotton paper so it stays damp for quite a long time, I'm putting in a slightly richer mixture of the indigo and the Paynes grey on my rigger, and I'm just pulling up the indications of tree trunks in the far distance. Now these will blend out, they'll blur, they'll soften, they might even disappear a bit into the damp background, but that's what I want because this is my underpainting for my slightly more distant trees that will recede back into the mist. Now I've pulled those tree trunks on the left up out of the painting, and I quite like that, so I think I'm going to do that with some slightly richer paint or slightly drier paint on this side too. I'm not worried too much about accuracy as long as I get nice thin marks, and I want them to be sort of slightly leaning into the picture so that they act as a sort of framing device. Maybe some slightly thicker, drier paint so that I get some differentiation here and there so that some of the trees seem to look slightly further forward. These darker ones will look further forward. The paler the trees, the more blurry and diffused they are, the further back they'll look. And now this is just a plastic store card, and I'm just using the corner of the card and I'm pulling it through the damp paint, and it's creating these sort of white etched marks, and that gives me variety to my tree trunks. It's something that a lot of artists will do. Some people will use a palette knife for this technique, or the end of a paintbrush, or even their fingernail. I find a plastic card, the corner of that, can be very useful and very easy to control. Now these white marks add a bit of shape, a bit of texture and a bit of variety. I'm now taking a clean damp flat brush and I'm going to draw it horizontally through where I'm going to have my stream, just to begin to take out some sort of faint reflections or faint sort of ripple marks or light on the water, that sort of thing. Just effects that will help to give me the impression of my woodland stream as I build up the painting. As the paper is still wet, all these marks and effects that I'm putting in should just soften out. Now the brush is clean and damp and I'm just going to move it around between my little white horizontal lifted lines and just feather some of the paint that's already on the page and slightly damp around, so I just get those kind of soft sort of horizontal marks to get the water started off. Now that will do for my underpainting. I'm going to leave it to dry completely and then come back and carry on with the painting. Now it's completely dry, and so I have mixed up quite a rich, almost tube consistency, fairly dry mix of indigo and perylene green, and I'm just going to use the tips of my harky brush, and you could use any flat brush or any harky brush for this, just to use the edges to bring in the shapes of banks, just roughly, just using the brush itself and the marks that it gives me on a slight slope, and then flattening them out as I come to the edges of the stream. This will just give me a quite quick and effective stream banks. And with a smaller brush, I'm just adding some raw sienna into the green stream banks. That will just soften out and give some slightly lighter areas on the riverbank, some sort of paler and brighter spots that are just picking up the light a little bit more. I'm now going to mix up some similar thickness, almost tube consistency, quite dry Paynes grey, and I'm using the small harky brush just to dot that around and dash that around underneath the stream banks that I've painted, just to add shadow and texture. Something and nothing. There could be rocks there, there could just be grassy banks or moss, tree roots, that sort of thing. Just whatever, something and nothing to border the stream. Now I'm just using my flat brush just to pull the damp paint with the tips of the flat brush very gently from the banks, just to pull them into the water with just gentle horizontal brush strokes. And now, while the rich paint is still nice and damp but not too wet because it's rich and thick, I'm using a small cut piece of a store card, a plastic store card, just to pull up sticks, twigs, brambles, undergrowth, reeds, all that sort of thing, just up to add texture to my foreground stream banks. Now it's time to start to paint in my foreground trees. So I'm mixing up a rich inky consistency and well pigmented mixture of varying amounts of Paynes grey, sepia and indigo, and I'm just using my, I think it's a number 2 or a number 3 rigger. This is a Daler Rowney graduate rigger. I'm using it just to pull up my foreground trees. I want them to be quite, sort of the branches to be quite thin and quite tall. I don't want thick tree trunks here. I want sort of fairly wild but still slightly stylized woodland trees here. And what I'm doing is I'm starting off with nice thick paint at the base of the tree trunk and then pulling the brush up and slowly releasing the pressure as I go further up the page so that my brush stroke becomes slightly thinner and paler, and also as the paint runs out of the brush I'll get some paler marks and maybe some sort of dry brush effects which will add to the texture and interest of the tangle of branches that I'm trying to paint here. I'm trying to make sure that some of my branches crisscross and that they don't look too evenly spaced out. Flicking the brush off at the end of each stroke, again just to get more branches towards the ends that are finer, and so that they eventually taper off into twigs at the ends of the finer branches. I'm pulling some of these branches across into the light in the middle of the page as well, and some of them out across the tape so it looks as if they go out of the frame. I'm taking my time. This process is done with sort of wet paint on a dry painting, so I can take my time to build up as many or as few branches as I like. I've already got my background branches that were and trees that were created when I did the underpainting, so now this is just filling in that top foreground layer. I think this side's nearly done, and I think just a few more branches, just filling in some gaps, crisscrossing and overlapping some of the branches again, building up this nice tangle of branches. Now I'm going to move over to the other side. I'm going to paint this side in exactly the same way, using the same mixture of paint, the same brush strokes. Just trying to lean some of the trees slightly inwards so that I'm framing the light. The light is the star of this painting. There are 2 full-length tutorials for this that show just about every brushstroke on Patreon. So if you're interested in full-length tutorials, then maybe take a look at the link below. So I'm just making sure that that there is some variety to the distance and direction that my tree trunks are painted in. Sometimes I might dip into a little bit more blue, sometimes a little bit more brown or a bit more grey, again just to change up the shade of dark that I'm using. If you try this painting, don't worry if it doesn't look exactly the same as this. These tutorials that I do are really more just to show you sort of like methods of painting, or ways that I tackle certain types of scenes, and to maybe give you some clues and ideas as to how to create your own similar sort of scenes for yourself. You could use any colour combinations. You don't have to use the ones that I've used. And of course you could use a stipple brush or any other brush that you like for the purpose to add leaves. This could be a lovely spring or a summer scene if you add leaves onto the branches, but I like the sort of stark stylized winter tree look here, especially as I'm concentrating here on having that lovely misty distant glow. And if I need to, I will just darken up the banks around the base of the trunks and maybe pull out some sticks and twigs or low-growing branches too. All the time looking at both sides of the painting and making sure that things are kind of balancing out. Just filling in between some of the larger branches now with smaller twigs. Overlapping and tangling. I think I'm nearly there. Just need to add a little bit more. Now I'm pulling up with the plastic card through the damp paint, the thick damp paint, across the trees. What it's doing is it's bringing some sort of dragging the paint out in places and giving me some paler marks, but it's also where I'm dragging the paint out with the corner of the card, it's creating some dark marks, some sticks and twigs. So again, random texture, more layers, and it's just adding to the sort of 3D look, just adding more detail, suggested detail to the foreground and pushing all the misty distance even further back. And just a final few adjustments, feathering in the existing paint with a damp flat brush into the stream, and then going back in with some slightly darker paint in some areas on this distant tree here, where it's just dried a little bit lighter, so getting a bit of really rich Paynes grey in there. Just a few last branches. And I think I'm quite happy with that. I think we'll call that one finished for now. I'm going to peel off the masking tape, being careful to pull it away from the painting so that if it was to tear, it won't tear into the painting and ruin it. And once the tape is removed, it reveals a lovely flat painting with a nice white border, which gives us an idea of how it would look if it was framed. And I think that this has come together quite successfully. I've got what I wanted, which was that nice glow of misty distance, and the trees are quite stylized, and their branches kind of frame the central misty area, giving it quite a nice sort of mysterious look. Well, I hope that was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks so much for your support. Please like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe, and if you click on the bell icon, you'll be notified whenever I post a new video. And finally, thank you so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. I'll see you again soon. Stay safe and happy painting. Bye.